about diversity, inclusivity of life experiences and communities. And I think we've all talked about diversity, inclusivity, especially as we looked at gender, racial lines, nationality, what have you, age. But the angle that I want to talk about here today is more on the life experiences side. And I believe it's something that really affects all of us. Some of us don't realize it, and it also affects people in our communities, and also folks don't realize it. A little bit of my background here, which maybe hopefully helps of where I like to be a subject matter expert on is, I've been involved in 20 plus years in open source. I've participated a lot in the PHP community. I actually was a maintainer of the PHP Windows installer, which I just saw on Twitter the other day that it's been discontinued, which is an end of an era. Did a lot of community management in various communities, Sugar CRM for a number of years. I worked with Open Social, actually helped in its wind down, a board member for it too. And here in my role at the Linux Foundation, I've been fortunate to work across numerous different industries and projects in the big data, motion picture world, mainframe space, data science. And with those, also a number of communities that roll up into those as well. But where I really see the subject matter expertise coming from is being a dad. And these are actually not all of them are my kids. The young lady on the left is actually my niece, but she's with us kind of all the time, so she kind of rolls in and kind of more of a daughter. But what's really interesting and is what really has taught me a lot in not just my career but just my life is looking at the backgrounds that all of them have had. The oldest, my niece there on the left, like I said, she's with us all the time because her mom really isn't involved in her life, and her dad gave her rights to her. My daughter, has struggled with dyslexia, and it has been a huge challenge for her as she sort of went through life and some of the experiences there. My middle son is, ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and also we adopted from Korea about a decade ago. My son next to that, we adopted probably about 5 years ago from China. He was 4.5, and at that point he had been severely malnourished, abused, really in a bad spot, and he has a ton of trauma that comes from that. We'll sort of talk about what trauma means here in a moment. But that's a huge part of his story and the things that he's had to wrestle with. And the youngest, on the far end there, we also adopted her from China. She had a birth defect, a heart defect called tetralogy of Fallot, which is a very correctable one here in the United States, usually corrected a few months after birth. But when she was adopted at age 3 in China, they didn't correct those at the time. And, not only of just sort of the trauma, from being abandoned from her birth family, but also the larger trauma here that we've interacted with as well.
You need to read the email from Rose.
So sorry about that. I have some background. My son's giving me a note here in the background. This is the fun of doing virtual presentations, right? So let's again, when I say trauma, what does that mean? We might be very familiar with this bottom term of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is really an anxiety disorder that when you are involved in, a deep traumatic event, such as folks that, might have been in combat, they might have experienced a horrific death or horrific accident of something that has happened in front of you, all of those sort of things is kind of almost considered a little bit of what's called a big T in trauma. But really, the psychological trauma, which is often referred to as a little t, is you had an experience in life that has shaped you in a way that has changed how you engage with others or the rest of the world. It could be just something as simple as, maybe in school that you had friends pick on you. Maybe you were, if you were in a sport, maybe you were picked over by someone else. Maybe you had parents that yelled at you a lot. Maybe you had, you weren't the favorite of your siblings. Things of that nature. Maybe it could be a number of things, and it can even scale up to larger things, physical or mental abuse, hunger, all of those pieces. If there's a scale of where trauma can fit into, but those experiences all build up to affect you in one way or another. And they overwhelm the body, and and you have different sort of responses to events, which may not necessarily be a logical response. They may not be just the normal response, but they're a response. And it's a result of something that has happened to you in the past that is built up to that. Facts about this, and this is a few years old stat, but I think it's kind of very true. And it's a lot of the research that I've even seen within COVID-19, actually, some of this is even getting higher. 70% of adults in the US have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their life. Running the numbers, that's, well over 200 million people. Huge. Up to 20% of those people. So if you look at that, number, up to 20% of those people will actually develop PTSD. And if you also want to kind of build what the numbers are out from that, now that is, almost, 45 million people, right? So PTSD is that first experience that might have triggered you, that might have changed sort of your mental state of mind. Now that's got to the point where it develops into a larger disorder, where it is affecting you in much larger ways. An estimated number of 8% of Americans, roughly 25 million people, have PTSD at any given time. If you put that in perspective, that's Texas. Not that you could take your own drawings from that, but imagine the entire state of Texas would be affected by PTSD. That's how large of a number we're talking here. Interestingly enough, if you would break this down by gender lines, 1 out of every 9 women develops PTSD, actually making them twice as likely as men. And I think we've seen a lot of the Me Too movement and many of the activities that have happened within there, many of the things that have happened to young women and girls and over time here, certainly you can see where that connection is been made within there, and different life experiences that they might be more likely to have versus a male. That's not really that surprising of a statistic, really. So summing this up, for those of you who are working in developer communities, there is a fairly good chance that folks in your community are suffering from the effects of trauma in one way or another. And that's a harsh thing to think about. That's a kind of a sad state to think about, but it's a reality. How do you know when this is happening here? These are some of sort of the bigger pieces within here, and these signs and symptoms. Some of them are huge pieces like flashbacks and nightmares and things of that nature. But then there's also just some lower end things that you just don't think about. Low energy. People that are kind of avoiding, kind of checked out a little bit. Folks that have activities that are trying to get in control of a situation. Often, I've even, seen, areas with this where people might have more leadership roles. And this is, I guess, more specific to an open source community. They might have more leadership control roles in a community, and they struggle. They look to take on more and more and more, and they struggle to give things up. That could be, some sort of trauma that's sitting in the background. Impulsive, self-destructive behavior. Some of this can be physical, but then some of this also could be engaging within, the community. People that are, really out there tackling things, or really kind of, pushing people away, attacking people. There's a lot of these sort of things. And oftentimes this has been looked at as these are bad behaviors. These are bad actors within the community. And certainly they're causing that. Like, certainly if you take that aspect and you reflect on that, that's certainly a big challenge. But I think really where a lot of the reality sometimes is there's always something behind that. And that's an interest. It's a challenge one to sort of dig into. One of the things that I've learned a lot about in the last couple of years, and a lot of this really applies more to children and folks that are in sort of more of their developing phases within their lives, is this concept of trust-based relational intervention. And I mention it only out of the aspect of just sort of giving all of you sort of an idea of what this looks like, from a development standpoint. The idea was created by a psychologist, Dr. Karen Purvis and Dr. David Cross. They wrote even a book around this as well. A lot of the background was for models from children who really just come from very hard places, and how to understand sort of what those risk factors were of, things of just prenatal stressors, a traumatic birth experience, early neglect, things like that. A lot of these are seen very often from, children adopted who are institutionalized or foster care. But they could also be around children that, may not have had the most nurturing or otherwise had sort of, abusive or neglectful childhood, and especially a lot of those early years. What's really interesting about this, and I think maybe has a little bit of a play here, is, there's often been a thought of you correct this by the behaviors that they're having a negative feedback to them, such that they naturally find their way to the positive side of things. And the reality is a lot of where the corrections and how really these things are changed here is actually from a deeper brain psychological perspective, but it's built on the idea of how do we connect and empower, and first, and then that comes around with the correcting as well. So there's other principles other than just the correcting. I encourage you to learn about this work. Again, it's not a one-to-one applicable situation, but I think there could be, this will, I think, really help a little bit where I'm coming from and some of the ideas. What really this connects with is the symptoms that, we talked about, or that I presented 2 slides ago, around where the reactions to trauma and some of those negative behaviors are happening in the community. Often those things aren't really even a choice. The brain in many cases is just rewired. And if you know a lot about brain psychology, there are 2 areas within the brain, the hippocampus, which is a storage area for sort of the most recent sort of your conscious memories, and the amygdala that is sort of the emotional alarm. It kind of works with a lot of where your emotions. When you're impacted by trauma, and the interesting thing is your brain is very well wired, is very well connected on a lot of different levels between a lot of these systems, and is constantly in a wiring mode. This isn't something that you're wired once and you're stuck with. You're constantly rebuilding those neurological paths over time. But when you have a traumatic event, the hippocampus is storing that memory, and all of a sudden the amygdala is rewired to hit that fight or flight response. And often when your body doesn't know how to do anything else, that's what kicks in, is that fight or flight response. And oftentimes you see this referred to as sort of a lower brain response. And this is just from the physical side of things, is the amygdala is very low in the head, versus the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus are very much on the higher level of thinking. So it's sort of an interesting thing here. Your brain, when you're encountering some sort of an external stress on the body, it's a very natural thing, and it's actually a very evolutionary thing. That's how you're responding. You're responding in that fight or flight. I need to keep myself safe. I need to take control of the situation. So when you're having someone that encounters something that has been a triggering event of them in their lifetime, their brain shoots there right away. The feeling of rejection, the feeling of not being included, the feeling of being challenged, the feelings of all these things. When people have traumatic events that have shaped them, they're immediately kicking down into that lower brain. So thinking about this, what does it all mean? A very well-adjusted and person who's thinking in that upper brain can have those secure, controlled value feelings. But when you're in that lower brain, you're trying to keep yourself alive in your mind. Like that's where your head completely goes. You feel that you're unsafe, so you're trying to create that safety. You don't feel that value in the world, so you have that negative self view of yourself, and you don't feel like you're a part of a group. You feel like you're an outcast. So the trauma gets you not feeling in control of yourself. The lack of control it creates destructive behavior, which is actually sort of an interesting thing, that you would think that if you're not feeling included, you're not feeling secure, that you do activities to create that. Oftentimes it's easier to control people from negative reactions versus positive ones. So in other words, if you don't think you can control a situation in a positive way, you'll do it in a negative way. Like, that you can trigger negative responses out of people, and that's a predictable thing, and how that's going to go. That is giving you a sense of control, right? And when you're seeing that, it feeds into these other, I'm useless, I'm an outcast, you're self-shaming yourselves, and it feeds into all of that. Like you're triggering out that behavior out of people because you know how they're going to respond, and it's really interesting. I think we've even seen that with some of our children as well. Is they know if you can't control a situation in a positive way, they switch to a negative way, and you might have even seen that in the communities and groups that you've worked with as well. So, as a community, and I think one of the key things to think about here is, are developer and open source communities a substitute for mental health therapy? Absolutely not. Do I encourage communities to try to feel like that they need to rehabilitate people completely? Absolutely not. That all said, there are ways that as a community and as the communities you're engaging with, you can become better engaging with those suffering from trauma. So I think the first concept that has been coming of age here, and we see this in a lot of school settings and a lot of other social settings, and I think this is starting to come up more to people more in adulthood, is the concept of being trauma informed, and really what this means here is, as an organization or a group, you recognize trauma's there. You recognize what it looks like. You respond in a way understanding trauma, and you don't want to re-traumatize the person and go to some negative path. So paths to do this is making that community that you're working with a safe place. First and foremost, have a code of conduct, and not just of the thou shalt nots, but also the thou shalt do's. I think that's we often sometimes rule from a legislative aspect, but not from a connective and building relation aspect. And when you're thinking about a code of conduct, whether it's be an open source community or if you're even running a developer communities and outreach of your organization, having that code of conduct it not only just dictates what bad behaviors are, but it's more importantly saying, what are the behaviors we want to see? Like, what are the things that we want to see happening in our community, and really look to strike and enforce them. The way a code of conduct gets enforced is having people that know how to showcase that sort of model. Be the examples out there, both in a positive and also in a corrective way. One thing that I've often see communities do is that they're often really good of kind of the grandstanding of, look, I did this really well, half of things, right? I don't know, I'm kind of struggling for an idea. What you often don't see is people that recognize, like, hey, I screwed this up. Like, I got angry at this person and lashed out in a negative way, and I shouldn't have done that, right? Creating sort of that thing, because then, another model that we sometimes see here is a number of these folks that do negative things and they want to correct it. They don't feel the community safe enough to do it because they feel it's such a legislative way to handle the issue. Where instead, if they feel comfortable enough to step up and say, look, I screwed up and I'm sorry. And I'm going to make it better by doing this. You're creating that healing process, and you're also messaging out to everybody, this is a safe place that you can be that person with, as opposed to feeling like you have to be on guard and collected backwards. And I would say always, as you're getting any of these issues that pop up, and often they're a very sensitive way, handle it privately. Don't air your dirty laundry out there in public. Don't take this offline. Talk with the person one-on-one. Help work with them one-on-one, but don't drag it out in the public space. Improve your way how you engage with people, right? So one of the big things, and I'm really horrible at this, is listening more. I like to talk a lot, and I don't listen as much. And when you listen, you get to hear people, but then you also you can also shift your focus to trying to solve the problem for them, but showing empathy, right? You don't have to be the solution to all your problems, but you can show that, hey, I understand. I'm here for you. I'm here just to listen, right? And with that, even when you're engaging with somebody that you maybe don't have the most positive relationship or engagement with, shifting how you speak from an I statement to a you statement. And what we mean by that is, let's say someone comes and yells at you, right? They start a flame war, in an email, right? And a you statement is, well, you yelled at me in this email, right? That's creating confrontation. An I statement is, I felt really scared by that email. It changes the whole dynamic of how this comes together, right? And it also creates that empathy, because it disarms that other person, where it's not of you're trying to attack their behavior, but you're saying, this is how it made me feel. And it lets them also get retrospective, and it lets them kind of drop out of that fight or flight, where if somebody's saying you did this, you automatically feel like I have to, attack them. Like I have to defend myself. When somebody is saying, this is how you made, when I heard this, I felt that, it changes that whole dynamic, right? And obviously use good compromising skills. There's, just like in anything in life here, the idea is not to win. The idea is to drive together, successfully together, right? And we even do this with all of, the open source projects that I work with. The one thing I stress with some of those communities is make decisions by consensus. And it's not as a sense you're boiling things down, but you want to listen to everybody. You want to understand that people's voices are heard. And maybe they have a very legitimate concern that needs to come up here, but use that as a path to compromise, to understand where that person's coming from of the decision you're making, so you all can feel good about walking away from what happened. So there's a lot of resources in this. And this I've really scratched the surface of what this is. I mean, there's so much research out there. A lot of the things that I point to are very much focused on PTSD, trauma-informed, and part of child development. And I know it's sort of a little bit of a different thing than a one-to-one application with communities, but I think a lot of the concepts and a lot of the approaches, I think, have a really nice pattern here. I encourage you to check a lot of these things up, or check a lot of these things out. And I want to leave you all with a parting thought here, and then we're going to kick into Q&A here, and I realize we're kind of real tight on time here. For years, and this is from Bruce D. Perry, who's a senior fellow child trauma, the Child Trauma Academy in Houston, and an adjunct professor of psychology and behavior sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine, Chicago. Accomplished author, really smart person. For years, mental health professionals taught people that they could be psychologically healthy without social support, that unless you love yourself, no one else will love you. The truth is, you cannot love yourself until you have been loved and are loved. The capacity to love cannot be built in isolation. A way to think about this is isolating folks that are really struggling with this is not a path to rehabilitation. The fact that when you know someone out there cares for you and is there for you, and wants to see you succeed, that's building those neural pathways and that capacity to, build reciprocity in that relationship. So with that, I'm at the end here. I know we are at the end of this here. I appreciate everybody's time and interest in this. I hope this has been helpful for you. I'm on Twitter and a lot of different channels. I'm really happy to always talk about this and more. This is a real passion area of mine. And I'm hopeful that this has maybe added some insight to you as you engage folks in your community. And with that, I'll open the floor to any questions that might be out there.
Hey, John, that was great. We actually do have some questions. And I also would encourage everyone, if they have questions, that they can ask in the Slack channel and on YouTube. So Josh Wolf has the following question from YouTube. And his question is, what's the one thing that we can take on as a practice from this, either for ourselves or others? I think you kind of covered it, but I mean, I guess if you had like the one thing, what would you suggest?
Put yourself in the other person's shoes and try to understand where they're coming from. They're humans. They're human. That other person is a human just like you. They have the same struggles of you. They have all the components of what a human is like. Put yourself in their shoes. Don't be quick to respond, but put yourself in their shoes and try to understand who they are and where they're coming from. It's a great mental exercise, and it really changes the dynamic of how you think about these interactions.
I always used to think of I always love the golden rule, but the platinum rule is the one that I love the most, which is treat others better than you treat yourself. Exactly.
No, that's a really good way to look at it. Yeah.
Are there any examples of communities that you've seen that have done a really good job with this? Maybe there's that have stuck out.
I have one sort of personal story in this area of a community I worked with. And they were with the Links Foundation. They were one that we were just getting ramped up, And there was a lot of antagonism that was happening between myself from a Linux Foundation staff perspective and some of the community leaders. And we were really bumping heads a lot. There was just a lot of, I mean, I wouldn't say gigantic issues, but there was just bubbling percolating issues. And I got on the phone with this individual one time, and I know that we were sort of having some antagonism going back and forth. And I said, here's what I'm going to do. I want you to air all of the things you are frustrated about. I am going to put myself on mute. You have 10 minutes. I am going to put myself on mute so I'm not tempted to cut you off. I'm not tempted to address. I'm just going to sit here and listen, and I'm putting myself on mute specifically. Empty it out. Tell me everything. And he did that. And I think I came back with like a page and a half of notes of stuff. And it was a really therapeutic thing. I think it was therapeutic for that individual because that person even told me afterwards, like, I'm really glad we did that. That was really, really helpful for me. And for me also is I wasn't guessing. I wasn't trying to like guess what, because of what they were doing, of what they were thinking. I actually got to hear like what they're really upset about. So that was one that, and since then we actually built a really good working relationship from there as well. And even a degree of a personal relationship as well. But I remember that as just a huge turning point and just one of the tactics I used there. And it was really good. And it turned out even better results than I would have thought.
Well, that's a fantastic way to go about it. Certainly the 10-minute, letting them have the space to speak. And of course, I always found it good too when you're taking all those notes to kind of resume how they're feeling to make sure that you got it correctly.
Yes.
Because sometimes you may misunderstand, and it's always good to just open up that conversation. That's
almost like restating it back. It's like, I think I heard this. Did I get that right? I mean, those are also even just good exercises when you're in a conversation, you're trying to address issues with people. Is exactly that. Is, I think I took this note. I think what I heard you said is this. Did I get that right? Am I understanding? Even sometimes when I answer questions from people, I always end the question with, did I answer the question you were going after? Did I answer your question right? Is this the answer you were looking for? Because it also just shares that you care about it. You're not just like, okay, here's what it is, beat sand if you don't like it. It shows that you just care, that they're walking away with, some sort of answer or resolution.